A 65-year-old woman is sitting at a bus stop in a small town in Tennessee. She looks up and her book falls from her hands. A man, a Navy SEAL, is walking toward her, leading a baby elephant on a soft harness. She knows that elephant. She saved him from a creek 1 week ago. But something is wrong. His tusks, those two small, perfect ivory buds she remembers touching while she held his head above the water, they're gone, cut off. All that's left are two raw scars on a face that is only 10 months old. She drops to her knees. She wraps her arms around his head, and the elephant's trunk reaches up and touches her shoulder. The exact same spot, the exact same way, as if 7 days never happened. She whispers, "I got you, baby." And she cries. Not because she is sad, because something that belonged to him was taken, and he is still here, still alive, still remembering her. My name is Wilder. I am 55. I have lived with animals longer than I have lived with people, and this is one of the most powerful stories I have ever told. Before I begin, where are you listening from right now? Drop your city in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Not for me, for the stories still waiting for you. Ridgewater, Tennessee, 11,000 people. The kind of town where the gas station clerk knows your dog's name, where the church bells ring twice on Sunday and once on Wednesday, where the tallest building is a 3-story courthouse with a clock that has been 7 minutes slow since 1994, and nobody has ever bothered to fix it. September heat in Ridgewater does not scream at you the way it does in Memphis or Nashville. It sits on your shoulders, quiet, heavy, like a wool blanket you did not ask for. The trees along the back roads are just starting to think about turning, the first few leaves going gold at the edges, and the creek that runs behind Porchfield Lane is running low, the way it always does before the October rains come. I want to tell you about a woman who lived on that lane. Her name was Margaret Collins. Everyone called her Maggie. She was 65 years old, 5'4", with silver hair she kept pinned back in a loose knot that always looked like it was about to fall apart, but never did. She had a round face, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and hands that were stronger than they looked. Hands that had spent 30 years writing on chalkboards, tying small shoes, holding small fingers during fire drills. She was not the kind of woman who walked into a room and turned heads. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and made it feel warmer. For 3 decades, she had taught 3rd grade at Ridgewater Elementary, and if you stopped anyone on Main Street and said the name Maggie Collins, they would smile before they said a single word, because every adult in that town under the age of 40 had sat in her classroom at some point, and none of them had forgotten her voice. That voice, patient and firm at the same time, like a hand on your shoulder that is gentle but will not let you fall. Her husband Richard died 2 years before this story begins. Lung cancer. He was a quiet man, a carpenter, the kind of person who said more with a nod than most people say in a paragraph. They had been married for 38 years. When he went, something in Maggie went with him. Not her kindness, not her warmth, but her sense of direction. She retired. She stopped driving. She started taking the number 14 bus into town every morning, buying groceries she barely needed, riding back, sitting on the porch swing Richard had hung the summer before the diagnosis. She was not unhappy. She was not depressed. She was waiting for something she could not name, something that would make the house feel less quiet, something that would give her a reason to wake up that was bigger than coffee. She did not know it yet, but that something was about to scream at her from the middle of a creek. It was a Thursday afternoon. Maggie was walking along the trail behind her house, the one that follows the creek down through a stand of hickory trees before it curves toward the Hollow Creek Wildlife Preserve, about 10 minutes away by car. She walked this trail most days. It was her version of church, she used to say. The water, the birds, the way the light came through the canopy like God was being careful with a flashlight. She was halfway to the bend when she heard it. Not a bird, not a deer, a sound she had never heard in 65 years of living in Tennessee. A cry, high-pitched, desperate, raw, like a child screaming underwater, something between a trumpet and a sob. She moved toward the sound. She pushed through the brush at the creek bank, and she saw it, a baby elephant, standing in the middle of the creek. The water was not deep, maybe 3 feet, but the calf was small, no bigger than a large dog, and its hind legs were tangled in a knot of submerged tree roots. It was thrashing. Its trunk kept reaching up, gasping for air, but the current kept pushing its head down. Every time it pulled free for a second, the roots dragged it back. It was losing. Think about what you would do. You are 65 years old. Your knees ache when it rains. You have not swum properly in 20 years. You are alone. There is no cell signal on this part of the trail, and in front of you, a baby elephant in Tennessee, is drowning. Maggie did not think. She told me later, if I had thought about it, I would not have done it. So I just did not think. She stepped into the water. The cold hit her chest like a slap. Her feet slid on the mossy rocks. She grabbed a tree trunk with one hand and reached under the water with the other, feeling for the roots wrapped around the calf's legs. The elephant was panicking, kicking, its trunk whipping across her face again and again. But Maggie talked to it. She used the same voice she had used on terrified 8-year-olds for 30 years. The voice that said, "I am here, and you are safe, and nothing bad is going to happen while I am holding you." "Shh," she said. "I got you. I got you, baby." 15 minutes. That is how long it took. 15 minutes of freezing water and burning knees and fingers bleeding from pulling at roots while a 100-pound animal thrashed against her. And then the last root came free, and the calf surged forward, and it swam, clumsily, desperately, to the bank, where it stood on the mud, shaking, legs barely holding. Maggie crawled out after it. She sat in the mud, soaked to the bone, breathing so hard she thought her ribs might crack. And the calf turned around. It walked back to her. It stood right beside her, close enough to touch, and it reached out its trunk and placed it gently on her shoulder. Just rested it there, like a hand, like a thank you, like a promise. Maggie looked at its face. She saw 2 small tusks, barely longer than her finger, white as milk, perfect, still growing. She touched one of them without thinking, and the calf did not flinch. She stayed with it for almost an hour before the Hollow Creek Rangers arrived. 2 men in a green pickup, one tall and sunburned, the other younger, barely out of college, both looking at Maggie like she was something out of a dream. They explained. The calf's name was Juno, 10 months old, part of an orphan elephant rehabilitation program at Hollow Creek. His mother had been killed by poachers in Mozambique, shot, her face sawed open for her tusks, and Juno had been found standing beside her body, pushing at it with his trunk, refusing to leave. He had been brought to the United States 3 months ago. He had escaped through a gap in the perimeter fence that nobody knew existed. They loaded Juno into the truck. Maggie stood on the bank and watched the vehicle disappear down the dirt road, her clothes dripping, her hands still shaking, her chest filled with something she had not felt in 2 years. That night, for the first time since Richard died, the house did not feel empty. And 3,000 miles away, in a military hospital in San Diego, a man named Jake Morrison was lying in a bed, staring at the ceiling, seeing things the ceiling could not show him. Jake was 34 years old, 6'2", built the way seals are built, wide shoulders, lean waist, hands that looked like they were designed for a purpose harder than shaking. His jaw was sharp, his hair buzzed short, and his eyes were the pale gray of winter ocean, the kind of eyes that looked calm on the surface, but carried a current underneath. He had just come back from Mozambique, a joint counter-poaching operation. On paper, it was a success. They dismantled the network, seized the weapons, arrested the leaders. But Jake brought something home that did not appear in any report. The image of a mother elephant lying dead in the red dirt, her face destroyed, and beside her, a calf pressing its trunk against her body, over and over, trying to wake something that would never wake again. The doctors called it PTSD. Jake called it failure. He had saved the law. He had not saved the elephant. When they gave him a medical discharge, temporary, they said, he did not go home to Virginia. He got in his truck and drove east, toward a place he had read about online, a wildlife preserve in Tennessee that took in orphaned elephants. He did not want to hold a gun anymore. He wanted to hold something alive. He did not know that the calf he could not save in Africa had a brother in spirit, 10 months old, in a preserve 10 minutes from a retired schoolteacher's house. He did not know that their paths were already converging, pulled together by something that has no name, but that I have seen enough times in the wild to know it is real. Maggie went back to her life. That is what people do. The extraordinary happens, and then the ordinary comes back, and you are supposed to fit inside it again like nothing changed. She woke up the next morning, Friday, brewed her coffee, sat on the porch swing, watched the September light move across the yard. Everything was the same. The tin roof, the hickory trees, the creek murmuring behind the property. Everything was exactly the same, and nothing was the same at all, because Maggie Collins could not stop thinking about a baby elephant. She called the preserve that afternoon. The number was listed on a small website that looked like it had not been updated since 2019. Hollow Creek Wildlife Preserve, established 2011, dedicated to the rehabilitation of orphaned megafauna. A woman answered, young, polite, the kind of voice that works a front desk and answers the same 12 questions every day. Maggie asked about Juno. "He's doing well, ma'am. Thank you for your concern." That was it. No details, no invitation, no, "Would you like to come see him?" Maggie thanked her and hung up. She called again on Saturday. Same voice, same answer, almost word for word. "He's doing fine, ma'am. We appreciate you checking in." On Sunday, Maggie did not call. She sat on the porch swing and argued with herself instead. "You are being ridiculous. You are a 65-year-old retired school teacher. You spent 15 minutes with an animal you had never seen before, and now you are calling a wildlife preserve every day like a worried grandmother. He is a baby elephant. He does not remember you. He does not know your name. He was scared. You were there. And now it is over. Let it go." But she could not let it go. And the reason she could not let it go was the trunk. That moment on the creek bank, after the water, after the terror, after the roots came free and the calf made it to shore. The moment Juno turned around, walked back to her, and placed his trunk on her shoulder. Not randomly, not the way an animal bumps into something and moves on. Deliberately, gently, the way you put your hand on someone's arm when you want them to know you are grateful, but you do not have the words. Maggie had read somewhere, she could not remember where, that elephants recognize faces, that they remember individuals for decades, that they mourn their dead, returning to the bones of family members years after they have passed, touching the skulls with their trunks in a ritual that scientists cannot fully explain. She went to the library on Monday. She came home with 4 books. She read about elephant grief, about how orphaned calves in Africa sometimes die not from starvation, but from loneliness, their hearts simply giving out because the presence they needed, the warmth, the heartbeat, the voice that said you are not alone, was not there. She read until 2 in the morning. She forgot to set the coffee maker for the first time in years. Richard had said something to her, near the end, when the morphine was making his words soft and slow, but his meaning was still sharp. "Maggie, you will know when life is calling you back. You just have to promise me you won't pretend you don't hear it." She had promised. She had held his hand and promised. And then he was gone, and the house went quiet. And for 2 years she had been listening for that call and hearing nothing. Until Thursday, until the creek, until a 10-month-old elephant put his trunk on her shoulder and made her feel, for the first time since the funeral, like she was needed. She wanted to visit. She wanted to drive out to Hollow Creek and see Juno, and make sure he was eating and sleeping, and not standing alone in a corner somewhere. But Hollow Creek was not a zoo. It was a rehabilitation facility. No public access, no visiting hours, no exceptions. She was just a civilian, an outsider, a woman with no credentials and no connection to the preserve, beyond a 15-minute accident in a creek. She knew this, she accepted it, and she kept reading about elephants anyway, because accepting something and letting go of it are 2 very different things. While Maggie was sitting in her living room in Ridgewater, turning pages and learning about animals she had never expected to love, a mud-splattered pickup truck was pulling through the front gate of Hollow Creek, 12 miles away. Behind the wheel was Jake Morrison, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had driven 2,000 miles without stopping for anything except gas and black coffee. His jaw was unshaved, his gray eyes were bloodshot, his knuckles were white on the steering wheel, not from the drive, but from something older, something that had been gripping him since Mozambique and had not let go. The woman who met him at the gate was Dr. Elena Vasquez. She was the preserve's director, 50 years old, born in Havana, raised in Miami, trained at Cornell. She was not tall, 5'5" at most, but she carried herself like someone who had been underestimated her entire life and had turned that into fuel. Her black hair was streaked with gray and pulled back tight. Her face was angular, sharp-boned, with dark eyes that evaluated you in the first 3 seconds and decided in the next 2 whether you were worth her time. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, nothing that suggested she cared about anyone's opinion of her appearance. Her hands were calloused from years of field work. She had spent a decade with orphaned elephants in Kenya before coming to Tennessee, and when she shook Jake's hand, her grip was harder than his. "You're the seal," she said, not a question. "Former," Jake said. "You drove from San Diego?" "Yes, ma'am." "To volunteer at an elephant preserve?" "Yes, ma'am." Elena looked at him the way she looked at everything, directly, without softness, measuring what was real and what was performance. "You're a soldier," she said. "What do you know about elephants?" Jake was quiet for a moment. He could have talked about the briefings, the intelligence reports, the months he spent studying poaching networks across southern Africa. He could have listed credentials, dropped acronyms, tried to impress her with what he knew. Instead, he said, "I know what they look like when they lose their mother." Elena did not respond right away. She studied his face, and whatever she found there, the sleeplessness, the guilt, the particular kind of damage that comes from seeing something you cannot unsee, it was enough. She turned and walked toward the enclosures. "Come on," she said. "I'll show you what we're dealing with." What they were dealing with was a crisis. Hollow Creek had been built to house 4 elephants, It now had 6, all orphans, all under the age of 3, all rescued from poaching zones in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Tanzania. Federal funding had been cut in the spring. 2 full-time keepers had quit in the past month. The pay was low, the hours were brutal, and the nearest town with a decent grocery store was 40 minutes away. Elena was running the preserve with a skeleton crew. Herself, one veterinary technician named Carlos, who was 26 and looked like he had not slept since March, and 2 part-time volunteers from the local college who came when they could and disappeared when exams started. And then there was the other problem, the one Elena did not mention until they were standing at the far end of the property, looking at a section of perimeter fence that had been repaired recently, the new wire shinier than the old. "Someone has been watching us," she said quietly. "We have heard from contacts in law enforcement that a trafficking network is interested in our calves, young elephants with juvenile tusks. The tusks are small, but that is the point. Baby ivory is easier to carve into jewelry. It sells for more per gram than adult ivory in certain markets in East Asia." She looked at Jake. "That fence you are looking at, that is where Juno got out last week, but I am not sure he got out on his own. I think someone cut it and he wandered through." Jake felt something shift inside his chest. The same feeling he had felt in Mozambique, standing over the body of the elephant mother. The feeling that the war was not over, that it had followed him here, across an ocean, into the green hills of Tennessee. He asked Elena if he could stay. She said yes, reluctantly, provisionally, the way someone agrees to something they do not fully trust, but cannot afford to refuse. That night, Jake walked the perimeter, alone. The air was warm and thick with crickets. The fence stretched ahead of him in the darkness, post after post after post. He stopped in front of Juno's enclosure. The calf was standing in the far corner, trunk curled inward, eyes open but unfocused, the way children look when they are awake, but somewhere else entirely. Jake stood at the fence for a long time, watching. He did not speak. He did not move. He just stood there, a man who could not sleep and an elephant who could not forget, sharing the darkness, in silence. And somewhere in that silence, Jake understood something he had not understood before. He and Juno were the same. Both of them had lost the thing that mattered most. Both of them were trying to survive without it. Both of them had ended up in the same place, not by accident, but because the world sometimes puts broken things next to each other and waits to see if they can heal. "4 days. That is all it took. 4 days between the moment Maggie pulled Juno from the creek and the moment someone came to take what was left of his innocence. 4 days between salvation and violence. I have seen this pattern before, out in the wild, in places where the distance between safety and destruction is measured not in miles, but in hours. You save something, you breathe, you think the worst is over, and then the worst shows up at 2 in the morning with bolt cutters and a bone saw. Jake had been at Hollow Creek for 3 nights. He had fallen into a rhythm that felt more natural to him than sleep, walking the perimeter after dark, checking fence posts, listening to the sounds the property made when the visitors and the staff were gone, and only the animals remained. He liked the night shift, not because he enjoyed the dark, but because the dark was honest. During the day, you could pretend everything was fine. At night, the truth came out. The fence was old, the cameras were few, and half of them did not work. The motion sensor lights along the eastern boundary had blown out in a storm last spring, and nobody had replaced them because there was no money and no time. Elena knew it. Carlos knew it. Carlos Delgado, the veterinary technician. 26 years old, thin as a fence post, with dark circles under his eyes so deep they looked painted on, and a quiet competence that Jake recognized immediately as the kind that only develops when you have been doing the work of 3 people for too long. Carlos never complained. He just moved from task to task with the mechanical focus of someone who had accepted that rest was a luxury he could not afford. Jake respected him. He also worried about him, because people who never stop are usually the first to break. It was a Monday night. The air was warm, still holding the last heat of September, and the crickets were so loud they sounded like static. Jake was walking the western fence line, the one that ran along a thicket of pine and sweet gum that nobody had cleared in years, when he heard it. Metal on metal. A small sound, precise, deliberate. Not an animal, not the wind. The sound of a tool biting through wire. His body reacted before his mind did. 20 years of training does that to you. It rewires the sequence. Normal people hear a threat and think, then act. Seals hear a threat and act, then think. Jake dropped into a crouch. He killed his flashlight. He moved toward the sound through the tree line, placing each foot the way he had been taught. Heel first, roll to toe, silent, deliberate. His heart rate did not spike. His breathing did not change. This was the thing about Jake Morrison that the doctors in San Diego did not understand, and the discharge papers could not capture. He was not broken in the field. He was broken in the stillness. Give him a threat. Give him a mission. Give him something to move toward in the dark, and every fractured piece of him snapped back into place like a rifle being assembled. He saw them through a gap in the brush. 2 figures, both wearing dark clothing, faces covered. One was tall, heavy-set, working the bolt cutters on the fence. The other was leaner, quicker, holding a veterinary tranquilizer rifle, the kind you can buy online if you know where to look, the kind that fires darts loaded with enough sedative to drop a 400-pound animal in under a minute. On the ground beside them, a canvas duffel bag, unzipped, and inside it, a battery-powered bone saw, the blade still wrapped in plastic. Brand new. They had come prepared. This was not opportunistic. This was planned. They were 20 yards from Juno's enclosure. Jake did not call the police. There was no time. The nearest sheriff's station was 35 minutes away, on roads that wound through hills and hollows like a drunk man walking home. By the time anyone arrived, these 2 would be gone, and Juno would be bleeding. Jake moved. The heavy one went down first. Jake came out of the tree line low and fast, caught him from behind, locked an arm around his throat, and squeezed until the man's knees buckled and his body went limp. The bolt cutters hit the ground with a clang that split the silence wide open. The second one turned. He was faster than Jake expected. He swung the tranquilizer rifle like a club, caught Jake across the shoulder, sent a jolt of pain down his left arm. Jake grabbed the barrel, twisted, pulled. The rifle came free. The man stumbled backward, found his footing, and ran. Not toward the road, not toward a vehicle, but toward Juno's enclosure. He had a dart in his hand. He must have pulled it from the rifle before Jake took it. And he was fast, faster than a man carrying guilt should be. And he reached the enclosure before Jake could close the distance. Jake heard the thud of the dart hitting flesh. A small sound, almost nothing. And then a bigger sound, the whine of the bone saw starting up. A high-pitched scream of metal that cut through the night like a blade through paper. By the time Jake reached the enclosure, the man was already inside, kneeling over Juno's face, the saw pressed against the base of the calf's left tusk. Juno was on his side, sedated, his legs twitching, his eyes half open but seeing nothing. The saw had already done its work on one tusk, and was halfway through the second when Jake hit the man from the side, full force, drove him into the fence hard enough to bend the post. The saw flew from his hands. The man scrambled, twisted free, and ran into the darkness. Jake did not chase him, because Juno was lying on the ground, and there was blood on his face, and the tusks, those 2 small, white, perfect tusks that Maggie had touched 4 days ago on the bank of a creek, were gone. Not cleanly, not surgically. The saw had cut at an angle, snapping the ivory near the base, leaving jagged edges and open wounds that bled freely into the dirt. The left side was worse. The cut had gone deeper, exposing tissue that should never see air. The right was shorter, messier, interrupted by Jake's tackle, but the result was the same. Both tusks destroyed, both wounds open. A 10-month-old animal, lying in the dirt, drugged and bleeding, with 2 raw holes in his face where something beautiful used to be. Jake knelt beside him. He put his hands on Juno's side and felt the heartbeat. Slow, too slow, but there. The calf's trunk twitched once, reached toward Jake's arm, found his wrist, and wrapped around it. Loose, weak, but deliberate. Jake did not pull away. He stayed exactly where he was, one hand on Juno's ribs, the other held by a trunk that did not have the strength to grip, but would not let go. Elena arrived 4 minutes later, running barefoot from her cabin in a t-shirt and shorts, medical kit in one hand, flashlight in the other. Carlos was behind her, already on the phone with the sheriff. Elena dropped to her knees beside Juno, shone the light on his face, and went still, just for a second. 1 second of silence that contained everything. The rage, the grief, the exhaustion of a woman who had spent her life trying to protect animals that the world kept finding new ways to destroy. Then the second passed, and she was working, cleaning the wounds, applying pressure, drawing antibiotics into a syringe with hands that did not shake because she would not allow them to. "The tusks will not grow back," she said quietly, without looking up. "He will live, but he will carry these scars for the rest of his life." Jake said nothing. He stayed beside Juno until the sky turned gray, until the crickets stopped and the first birds started, until the sedative wore off and the calf's breathing deepened into something that sounded less like dying and more like sleeping. His hand never left Juno's back. He sat there the way he had once sat beside a wounded teammate in a dark valley in Afghanistan. Not because he could fix anything, but because leaving was not something his body knew how to do. And sometime before dawn, when the preserve was quiet and Juno's trunk was still wrapped loosely around his wrist, Jake whispered something. No one heard it clearly, But if you had been close enough, if you had pressed your ear to the silence between the man and the elephant, you would have heard 5 words. This time, I won't leave. "7 days. 1 week. That is how long it takes for the world to rearrange itself around you without asking permission. 7 days earlier, Maggie Collins had been a retired school teacher whose biggest decision was whether to take the 7:15 bus or the 8:30. Now she was a woman who dreamed about elephants, who read books about elephants, who woke in the middle of the night and reached for her shoulder because she could still feel the phantom weight of a small trunk resting there, warm and deliberate, like a hand that did not want to let go. It was a Tuesday morning, 7 o'clock. The fog had not burned off yet. September fog in Ridgewater sits low in the hollows and creeps along the roads like something alive, turning the streetlights into soft yellow ghosts and muffling every sound until the whole town feels wrapped in cotton. Maggie was sitting on the metal bench at bus stop number 14, the same bench she had sat on every weekday morning for 2 years, the one with the peeling green paint and the small plaque that read, "In memory of Dale Hutchins, who never missed a bus." She did not know who Dale Hutchins was. She had never asked. But she liked sitting next to his name. It made her feel less alone. She had a book open on her lap. Elephant Memories. Her 3rd book about elephants this week. She had finished the first 2 in a kind of fever, reading the way she had not read since college, underlining passages, folding page corners, writing notes in the margins with a pencil that Richard had sharpened for her years ago, and that she could not bring herself to replace, even though it was now barely 3 inches long. She was reading about how elephants greet each other after separation, the spinning, the trumpeting, the way they rush toward each other and intertwine their trunks in a gesture that researchers call a greeting ceremony, but that looks, to anyone watching with honest eyes, exactly like a hug. She was reading about how the length and intensity of the greeting correlates directly with the length of the separation. The longer the absence, the more explosive the reunion, as if the elephant's body has been keeping count of every hour apart and needs to spend them all at once. She did not hear the footsteps at first. The fog swallowed sound, and the man approaching from the east side of Porchfield Lane was not the kind of man who made noise when he walked. But she heard something else, a low sound, almost sub-vocal, a rumble that seemed to come from the ground itself rather than from any particular direction. Not a truck, not a machine, something organic, something alive, something that vibrated at a frequency she had never heard from a bench at a bus stop in Tennessee. Maggie looked up. The book slid from her lap. She did not catch it. First, she saw the man. Tall, well over 6 feet, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, work boots that had seen real work, jeans that fit the way jeans fit on someone who does not think about how his jeans fit. His hair was buzzed short, his jaw was unshaved, and there was a quality to the way he stood, shoulders squared, weight balanced, eyes scanning the street and the sidewalk and the tree line behind the bus stop in a single smooth sweep that told Maggie, without her needing to think about it, that this man had been trained to enter rooms where bad things might be waiting. He was not from Ridgewater. Ridgewater men did not stand like that. Ridgewater men leaned against things and put their hands in their pockets and talked about the weather. This man looked like he was expecting the weather to attack. Then she saw what was walking beside him, and everything else disappeared. A baby elephant. Small, gray, ears too big for its head, the way they always are at that age, flapping gently with each step like 2 soft leaves in a breeze. It was walking with that rolling, slightly clumsy gait that elephant calves have, each leg landing a fraction of a second after you expect it to, as if the animal is still figuring out the mechanics of its own body. It was attached to the man by a soft cloth harness, not a chain, not a rope, a harness made of what looked like canvas and cotton, the kind of thing you would design if you wanted to guide an animal without hurting it. And on its face, 2 marks, red, raw, freshly healed but not yet faded. 2 patches of new skin, slightly darker than the gray around them, in the exact spots where, 1 week ago, 2 small white tusks had been growing. Maggie stood up. She did not decide to stand. Her body simply rose, the way bodies do when they recognize something before the mind catches up. She was staring at the elephant, at the tilt of its head, left, always left, the way it had tilted when it looked at her on the creek bank. At the small scratch on the right ear, the one she knew came from the underwater roots because she had been there when it happened, because her own fingers had bled pulling those roots free. At the shape of the trunk, at the particular way the calf placed its front feet, at 100 tiny details that her brain had apparently cataloged during 15 minutes of terror and adrenaline in a cold creek, and stored somewhere so deep that she did not even know she had them until this exact moment, when they all surfaced at once, like a flock of birds rising from a field. "Juno?" she said. Her voice broke on the second syllable. It came out as half a word and half a sob, and it sounded, even to her, like the voice of someone who has been holding something in for a very long time and has just realized she cannot hold it anymore. The calf stopped. Its trunk rose into the air, the tip curling and uncurling, sampling the fog, searching for something. Then it found it. Whatever it was, her scent, her voice, some frequency of her presence that registered in the ancient architecture of an elephant's memory, it found it, and everything changed. Juno made a sound, not the panicked scream from the creek, something else entirely. A short, high-pitched cry, almost musical, the kind of sound that the books on Maggie's shelf would call a contact call, the sound an elephant makes when it recognizes someone it has been separated from. The sound that means, I know you. The sound that means, you are still here. Juno pulled against the harness, not hard, not in panic, but with a steady, determined forward motion that the man in the flannel shirt did not resist. The calf walked toward Maggie, 5 steps, 6, 7, and when it reached her, it did exactly what it had done on the creek bank 7 days before. It raised its trunk and placed it on her shoulder. The same shoulder, the same spot, the same gentle, deliberate pressure, as if a week had not passed, as if the creek and the bus stop were the same place, as if time was something that happened to other creatures, but not to elephants, and not to the women who saved them. Maggie dropped to her knees. She put her arms around that enormous, ridiculous, beautiful head, and she felt the skin under her palms, rough, warm, alive, pulsing with a heartbeat that was stronger than it had been on the creek bank, stronger than it had any right to be after what had happened to this animal in the dark 3 nights ago. And she cried, not quietly, not politely. She cried the way you cry when something you thought was lost comes back to you, and you realize in the same moment that it has been changed, that something has been taken from it that cannot be returned, because she could see the scars. 2 raw patches on Juno's face, exactly where those perfect white tusks had been, those tiny ivory buds she had touched with her bleeding fingers while sitting in the mud, those markers of everything he was supposed to become. Gone, cut away, replaced by healing skin and a wound that would never fully disappear. Someone had done this. Someone had looked at this 10-month-old creature and seen not a life, but a commodity, not a baby, but a product, and they had taken from him the only thing he could never get back. And Juno was still here, still alive, still remembering the woman who had held his head above the water when his legs were tangled and the current was winning. Jake stood a few steps away. He had not moved since Juno pulled toward the woman. He was watching with the stillness of someone who has learned that the most important moments are the ones you do not interrupt. He had brought Juno out of the preserve that morning because Elena had ordered a follow-up examination. The wounds needed to be checked by a specialist at the veterinary clinic on the far side of town, a Dr. Juan Park, a Korean-American large animal surgeon in his 60s, who had quietly become the only person within 200 miles qualified to assess the damage. Bus stop number 14 was simply on the route. Jake had not planned this. He had not known that a retired schoolteacher would be sitting on a bench with a book about elephants at 7 in the morning. He had not known that Juno would stop, lift his trunk, and make a sound that Jake had never heard him make before, a sound of recognition, of joy, of something that the military had no word for, but that Jake understood anyway, because he had spent his whole life around creatures who communicated in ways that language could not capture. He watched the woman hold the elephant. He watched the elephant's trunk move from her shoulder to her face, touching her cheek, her forehead, her hair, the way elephants touch the faces of family members they have not seen in a long time. He watched Juno's body relax in a way it had not relaxed since the attack, the tension draining from his legs, his ears going soft, his eyes half closing, the whole animal leaning into this woman as if she were the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath him. "You know him?" Jake asked. His voice was quiet, not cold, not suspicious, just careful, the way you speak when you can see that something sacred is happening, and you do not want to damage it with the wrong word. Maggie looked up. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet, her silver hair falling loose from its knot. "I saved him," she said. "Last week, in the creek. He was drowning." She paused. She looked at Juno's face, at the 2 scars, at the absence where the tusks had been. He still had his tusks then. The sentence hung in the morning air like a verdict. He still had his tusks then. 7 words that contained an entire tragedy, a before and an after, a line drawn across a baby elephant's face that divided his life into the time when he was whole and the time when he was not. Jake knelt beside her. He did not speak right away. He had learned, in 20 years of operations and hospitals and debriefings, that silence is sometimes the only honest response to a thing that words cannot fix. Then he said, "I couldn't save his tusks, but I saved him." 2 sentences, simple, ordinary. And yet Maggie felt something shift when she heard them. Some tectonic plate deep inside her chest, moving into a new position. Because she understood, immediately and completely, that this man carried the same weight she did. The weight of arriving almost in time. The weight of saving most of something, but not all of it. The weight of knowing that what you rescued will always bear the mark of what you could not prevent. They looked at each other. A 65-year-old retired school teacher with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and hands that still remembered the feeling of underwater roots. A 34-year-old former Navy SEAL, with gray eyes and an unshaved jaw, and hands that still remembered the feeling of a bone saw being knocked from a stranger's grip in the dark. And between them, a 10-month-old elephant calf, with 2 scars on his face, and a trunk that was touching both their shoulders now, moving from one to the other and back again, gently, deliberately, as if he were introducing the 2 halves of his life to each other, and asking them, in the only language he had, to stay. The story left the bus stop before Maggie did. She did not post anything online. She did not call anyone. She did not even finish her sentence to Jake before it started. Across the street from bus stop number 14, there was a flower shop called Hawkins in Bloom, and behind the glass window of that shop, arranging a vase of white hydrangeas, was a woman named Mildred Hawkins. Mildred was 72 years old, barely 5 feet tall, with a perm so tight it looked like it had been set in concrete sometime during the Reagan administration, and had not moved since. She wore bifocals on a chain around her neck, and floral print blouses every single day of the year, including Sundays, including funerals. She was the kind of woman who knew every piece of information in Ridgewater approximately 11 minutes before anyone else, because she spent her days standing behind a counter that faced the main street, and she watched everything the way a hawk watches a field, quietly, patiently, and with total accuracy. Mildred saw Maggie stand up. She saw the book fall. She saw the elephant. She saw the kneeling, the crying, the trunk on the shoulder. And she did what Mildred Hawkins had done every day for 40 years when something interesting happened on Porchfield Lane. She picked up her phone and called her daughter. Her daughter, Tammy Hawkins Wells, was 38, a dental hygienist in Knoxville, who had moved away from Ridgewater the day after high school graduation, and had never looked back except on Thanksgiving. Tammy put it on Facebook before her morning coffee was cold. By 10 o'clock, the post had 400 shares. By noon, the Ridgewater Gazette, a weekly paper run by a man named Ed Crowder, who had a mustache like a broom and a nose for anything that might sell an extra 50 copies, called Maggie's house. By evening, a reporter from Nashville, a young woman in a blazer who drove 3 hours on winding roads and arrived with a cameraman who looked like he would rather be anywhere else, was sitting in Maggie's living room asking questions about the creek, the elephant, the bus stop, and the scars. But the media was the surface, the easy part, the part that makes a nice story on the 6 o'clock news and then disappears into the scroll of the next day's feed. Underneath it, something harder was happening, something that did not fit in a headline. The second intruder, the one who had cut Juno's tusks, the one who had run into the darkness while Jake was pulling the bone saw from his hands, was still out there. The sheriff's department had taken a report. They had collected evidence from the scene: the bolt cutters, the canvas duffel, the tranquilizer rifle, the bone saw with its plastic wrapping still partially attached. They had fingerprints, boot prints, tire marks from a vehicle parked on a fire road half a mile from the perimeter. They had the first intruder in custody, a man named Darren Sykes, 41 years old, from Chattanooga, a hired hand with a long record of petty crime and a short record of saying anything useful. Sykes had lawyered up before the cruiser reached the station and had not said a word since. The FBI field office in Knoxville sent 2 agents. They were polite, professional, and honest about the situation. Wildlife trafficking was a federal crime, yes. It was a priority, technically, yes. But the Bureau had limited resources, and those resources were allocated by threat level. And the threat level of a baby elephant's tusks, however terrible, however heartbreaking, did not rank alongside fentanyl pipelines or domestic terrorism cells. They would investigate, they would follow leads, but they could not promise speed, and they could not promise results. Jake listened to the agents with the particular patience of a man who had spent years watching bureaucracies fail to keep up with the people they were supposed to stop. He shook their hands, he thanked them, and then he went back to his cabin at Hollow Creek and started doing what he had been trained to do, gathering intelligence. It took him 3 days. 3 days of phone calls to contacts he still had in military intelligence, in Interpol's Wildlife Crime Division, in the network of former special operations soldiers who had moved into private conservation security after leaving the service. A world most people do not know exists. Men and women who spent their careers in combat and then turned that training toward protecting animals instead of killing people. One of those contacts, a former Marine named Davis, who now worked anti-poaching operations in South Africa, gave Jake a name. Not the name of the man who ran, the name of the network that sent him. The network operated out of Atlanta. They bought juvenile ivory from sources across the southeastern United States, zoos with poor security, private collections, rehabilitation facilities, and shipped it through a series of shell companies to buyers in Vietnam and mainland China, where baby ivory was carved into pendants, bracelets, and figurines that sold for extraordinary prices precisely because of their rarity. An adult elephant tusk could weigh 100 pounds. A juvenile tusk weighed ounces, but those ounces, carved into delicate jewelry, were worth more per gram than gold. The network had been active for at least 4 years. Hollow Creek was not their first target. It would not be their last. And the reason they had known exactly where to cut the fence, exactly which enclosure held Juno, exactly when the night patrols were thinnest, was because they had someone on the inside. Jake found the name on a Thursday afternoon. He was sitting in Elena's office, cross-referencing the preserve's employee records with the information Davis had sent him, when a pattern emerged. An employee who had left Hollow Creek 3 months ago, who had been fired, actually, for repeated violations of animal handling protocols, who had access to every map, every schedule, every security weakness the preserve had. Nathan Boyle, 28 years old, former animal care technician, fired in June. Last known address, a rental house on the outskirts of Ridgewater that he had vacated 2 weeks before the attack. Elena went pale when Jake showed her the name. "I hired him," she said quietly. 2 years ago. He was good with the animals, gentle. The elephants liked him." She paused. "He started missing shifts last winter, coming in late. His hands were shaking. I thought it was drinking. It was gambling. Online poker. He owed money to people you do not want to owe money to. And when the network came looking for someone who knew Hollow Creek from the inside, Nathan was already desperate enough to say yes." She looked at Jake. "I fired him because he was unreliable. I should have seen what was underneath." While Jake was hunting Nathan Boyle, Maggie was fighting a different war. She did not have military training, did not have intelligence contacts, did not have the skills to track a fugitive through a network of shell companies and black market buyers. What she had was something Jake did not. She had Ridgewater. 30 years of teaching 3rd grade in a town of 11,000 people means you know everyone. Not in the abstract, polite way that politicians know their constituents. In the real way. The way that means you held their children's hands on the first day of school, wiped their noses during flu season, called their parents when they were struggling, and stood in the back of the auditorium clapping when they graduated. Maggie knew Ridgewater the way a root system knows the soil. Not from above, but from within. She started with phone calls. She called Bobby Durant, a barrel-chested electrician in his 40s who had been in her class in 1987, and who still called her Miss Maggie, even though he was now a grandfather. Bobby came to Hollow Creek the next day with 2 trucks full of equipment and installed 12 security cameras in 6 hours, free of charge. She called the Weaver brothers, Danny and Cole, who ran a welding shop on Route 9. They showed up with torches and steel plate and spent a weekend reinforcing every weak point in the perimeter fence. She called Pastor David Chen at Ridgewater Community Church, a slim, soft-spoken man in his early 60s who had come to Tennessee from San Francisco 20 years ago and had earned the town's trust so completely that his Sunday collection plate could fund almost anything he asked for. Pastor Chen devoted his next sermon to Juno. The collection that week was the largest in the church's history. She called Helen Pratt, the only attorney in Ridgewater, a sharp-jawed woman in her 50s who wore her gray hair in a bob and spoke in complete paragraphs, and had once told a county commissioner to his face that he was constitutionally incapable of telling the truth during a zoning hearing. Helen began drafting letters to the governor's office, to the state wildlife commission, to every elected official whose name she could find, demanding increased funding for wildlife crime enforcement in Tennessee. And then, the part that surprised everyone, including Maggie herself, the volunteers. They started coming on the second night after the Gazette article ran. Not organized, not coordinated, just people showing up at Hollow Creek's front gate after dark, asking if they could help. Farmers brought spotlight rigs from their deer stands. Hunters, and there was an irony in this that Maggie appreciated with a quiet, complicated smile, brought infrared binoculars and thermal scopes, and the kind of patience that comes from sitting in a tree stand for 6 hours waiting for a buck. Mothers from the PTA organized a meal rotation for the night patrol teams, dropping off thermoses of coffee and foil-wrapped sandwiches, and, on one memorable occasion, an entire slow cooker full of chili that Carlos ate so much of, he had to lie down behind the feed shed for 20 minutes. The teenagers, kids who had grown up on Maggie's reading lists and classroom rules, and the particular brand of firm kindness that made her the teacher every parent requested, created a Facebook group called Juno's Guard, that within a week had more members than the town had residents. Elena watched all of this with an expression that Jake could not quite read. He asked her about it one night, standing at the fence while the volunteer patrol moved along the tree line with flashlights bobbing like fireflies. 10 years, Elena said, and her voice was different than Jake had heard it before. Softer, less guarded, as if something she had been clenching for a very long time had finally begun to release. 10 years I have done this work. Elephants have died, funding has been cut, staff have quit, and no one has ever cared enough to stand in the dark and watch a fence. People hear about a dead elephant, and they are sad for 5 minutes, and then they forget. This is the first time I have seen a town stand up for an animal. She looked at him. Your school teacher did that. Not the news, not Facebook, her. Jake found Nathan Boyle on a Saturday. He had tracked him through credit card charges, a gas station in Pikeville, a motel in Crossville, a hardware store in Sparta where Nathan had bought duct tape and trash bags, purchases that could mean anything or everything. The trail ended at an abandoned tobacco barn on a county road 15 miles east of Ridgewater, set back from the pavement behind a wall of overgrown privet hedge. Jake called the sheriff, then he did not wait. Maybe it was the training, maybe it was the PTSD, maybe it was the image of Juno lying in the dirt with blood on his face, or the image of a mother elephant in Mozambique with her face sawed open, or the image of Maggie on her knees at the bus stop, crying into the neck of an animal that had been mutilated by the man now hiding in this barn. Jake did not analyze his own motivations, he just moved. The barn door was unlocked. The interior was dark, lit only by a single battery-powered lantern sitting on an overturned crate. The air smelled of dust and old tobacco, and something sharper, fierce sweat, the kind that the body produces not during exertion, but during collapse. Nathan Boyle was sitting on the floor in the far corner. He was 28 but looked older, thin, hollow-cheeked, with dirty blonde hair that had not been washed in days, and fingernails bitten down to the quick. He was not armed. He was not standing. He was sitting with his knees pulled to his chest, surrounded by the tools of his trade, a second bone saw still in its packaging, a set of veterinary syringes, a cooler that Jake assumed was meant to transport the ivory. None of it had been delivered. None of it had been used. Nathan had been sitting in this barn, alone, with the evidence of what he had done and what he had been about to do again, and he had not moved. He looked up when Jake entered. His eyes were red. His face was wet. He did not stand, did not run, did not reach for anything. He just looked at Jake with an expression that contained no defiance and no excuse, only the raw, animal exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something too heavy and has finally stopped walking. I hear it, Nathan said. His voice was barely above a whisper. All week, I hear it in my head. The sound it made. The baby elephant. When I was cutting, it looked at me. Its eyes were open. The sedative, it wasn't enough, or it was wearing off, I don't know. But it looked at me, and it made this sound. Not loud, not a scream, just this noise, like it was asking me why. He put his face in his hands. I can't stop hearing it. I close my eyes and I hear it. I open my eyes and I hear it. It won't stop. Jake stood in the doorway for a long time. He did not speak. He did not move closer. He listened to Nathan Boyle cry in the corner of a tobacco barn, and he thought about all the sounds that follow you home from the things you have done. The sounds that the discharge papers do not mention, that the therapists cannot locate, that live in a part of your brain where language has no authority, and forgetting is not an option. He thought about Mozambique, about the calf standing over its mother, about Juno's trunk on his wrist in the dark, about Maggie saying he still had his tusks then. He walked over to Nathan. He did not grab him. He did not threaten him. He sat down on the dirt floor, 3 feet away, his back against the wall, and he waited for the sheriff to arrive. 2 men in a dark barn, both of them haunted by the sound of an animal that could not understand what was being done to it. One of them had caused the wound. The other had arrived too late to prevent it. And in that silence, Jake thought a single thought that he would not share with anyone for a long time. How many people in this world are hearing that sound right now and do not know what to do with it? "6 months. That is all it takes for the world to change if the right people decide it should. 6 months earlier, Hollow Creek was a failing preserve with a skeleton crew and a fence that could be cut with hardware store bolt cutters. 6 months earlier, Maggie Collins was a woman sitting on a porch swing waiting for a reason to get up. 6 months earlier, Jake Morrison was a man who could not sleep because every time he closed his eyes, he saw a dead elephant in Mozambique and heard the sound of a calf that would not leave its mother's body. Now it was March, spring in Tennessee. The dogwood trees along the back roads had exploded into white, the way they do every year, sudden and total, as if someone had gone through the woods overnight and hung blossoms on every branch. The air was warm for the first time in months, carrying that particular smell of Tennessee spring, wet earth, honeysuckle, and something green and raw underneath, the smell of things pushing up through the soil because they cannot help it. Because growth is not a choice but a compulsion. Everything was coming back to life, including the things that people had given up on. Hollow Creek opened its gates to the public on the first Saturday of March. Not as a zoo. Elena had been very clear about that. She stood in her office the week before, arms crossed, staring at Jake and Maggie across her desk with those evaluating dark eyes, and she said, "This is not entertainment. These animals are not performers. If we open as an education program. People come, they learn, they leave understanding something they did not understand before. That is the deal. That is the only deal." Nobody argued. Nobody wanted to argue. Elena Vasquez was not the kind of woman you argued with. And by now, after 6 months of watching her work 18-hour days, sleep on a cot in the medical building, hand-mix nutritional supplements for 6 orphaned elephants at 4 in the morning, Jake and Maggie had both come to understand that her sharpness was not coldness. It was the outermost layer of a person who cared so deeply about the animals in her charge that she had built a wall around that caring to keep it from destroying her. The families came. They came from Ridgewater first, because Ridgewater had earned that right. The town that had stood in the dark and watched a fence. The town that had fed the patrol teams and reinforced the perimeter and raised more money in 3 months than the preserve had received in 3 years. Bobby Durant brought his grandchildren, 3 kids under 10 who stood at the fence with their mouths open while Juno walked past. The Weaver brothers came with their wives. Pastor Chen brought a group from the church. Mildred Hawkins came with a bouquet of flowers she had arranged herself, which she placed at the base of the preserve's entrance sign, with a small card that read, "For Juno," in handwriting so precise it looked like calligraphy. Then people came from further away, from Knoxville, from Nashville, from Chattanooga, from places that had seen the news coverage and the Facebook posts and the story that had somehow refused to die the way most stories do after the cameras leave. They stood at the new fence, heavy gauge steel, welded by Danny and Cole Weaver, monitored by 12 cameras that Bobby Durant checked every Monday. And they watched 6 orphaned elephants move through a landscape of grass and mud and shallow pools that Elena and Carlos had designed to mimic, as closely as Tennessee could manage, the conditions of a southern African savanna. Elena stood before each group with a portable microphone clipped to her shirt and spoke about conservation, about poaching, about the global ivory trade, about what it means to lose a species and what it costs to save one. She did not soften the facts. She did not make it pretty. She told them the truth, and the truth was hard. And the families stood there and listened, and some of them cried, and all of them left knowing something they had not known before. The ticket sales and donations from the first month alone were enough to hire 3 new staff members, a second veterinary technician, a full-time security officer to work under Jake, and an education coordinator who would eventually take over the Saturday programs so that Elena could go back to doing what she did best, which was keeping the elephants alive. The new security system, cameras, motion sensors, reinforced fencing, and a direct line to the sheriff's dispatch, was fully operational by the end of February. Carlos Delgado, who had been doing the work of 3 people for over a year, slept 8 consecutive hours for the first time since anyone could remember, and told Jake the next morning, with the dazed expression of someone who has discovered a new continent, "I forgot what dreams felt like." Nathan Boyle pleaded guilty in federal court in January. The deal was straightforward, full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. He gave the FBI everything: names, routes, account numbers, the locations of 3 other facilities the network had targeted. His testimony helped dismantle the Atlanta pipeline. 14 people were indicted across 4 states. The case made national news for a single cycle, then disappeared into the endless scroll, the way these things do, replaced by politics and weather and whatever outrage the internet had chosen for that particular Tuesday. But the pipeline was broken. The buyers in Vietnam and China lost their supply chain. And somewhere in a federal holding facility in eastern Tennessee, Nathan Boyle sat in a cell and wrote a letter. It was addressed to Dr. Elena Vasquez, Hollow Creek Wildlife Preserve, Ridgewater, Tennessee. It was 3 pages long, handwritten, and it asked a single question. When he got out, could he come back and work with the elephants again? Not as a technician, as anything. Cleaning enclosures, hauling feed, repairing fences. Anything that would let him be near the animals he had helped hurt, so that he could spend the rest of his life trying to make the equation come out different. Elena read the letter at her desk. She folded it carefully. She put it in the top drawer. She did not answer, but she did not throw it away. And when Maggie asked her about it, weeks later, Elena said only, "I am thinking about it," which, from Elena Vasquez, was almost the same as saying yes. Jake did not go back to the military. The discharge had been temporary, medical, with an option to return once the doctors cleared him. The doctors cleared him in November. He let the deadline pass. He had found something at Hollow Creek that the Navy could not give him. Not peace, exactly, because peace was not a word that fit Jake Morrison the way a shirt fits a man, comfortably and without effort. It was more like purpose, a reason to wake up that did not involve a weapon. His title was Director of Security, which sounded grand, but meant, in practice, that he walked the perimeter every night, trained the volunteer patrol teams every Saturday, coordinated with the sheriff's department, and spent the rest of his time doing whatever Elena needed done, which was usually something physical and unglamorous. Fixing a water pump, clearing brush from the eastern fence line, hauling 50-pound bags of feed from the storage shed to the enclosures. He still did not sleep well. The dreams from Mozambique had not stopped, but they had changed. They were quieter now, less sharp, as if the images were being slowly worn down by repetition, the way river stones are worn by water. And when he woke at 3 in the morning, gasping, reaching for a weapon that was not there, he did not lie in the dark and stare at the ceiling. He got up, he pulled on his boots, he walked to Juno's enclosure, and he sat there, on the ground, his back against the fence post, and listened to the sound of a young elephant breathing in the dark. Slow, steady, alive. It worked better than any pill the doctors had prescribed. It worked because it was proof. Proof that he had been in time. Proof that something he had protected was still breathing. Proof that the equation could come out different if you stayed long enough and fought hard enough and refused to leave when every part of you wanted to run. Maggie became the preserve's volunteer education coordinator. Every Saturday, she stood in front of a group of children, sometimes 10, sometimes 30, once an entire school bus from Knoxville, and she told them the story of Juno. She told them about the creek, about the roots tangled around his legs, about the 15 minutes of freezing water and bleeding fingers. She told them about the bus stop, about the trunk on her shoulder, about the 2 small tusks that had been there 1 week and gone the next. She told them about the scars on Juno's face, and she told them the truth about those scars, which was that they would never go away, that the tusks would never grow back, that some things, once taken, are taken forever. And then she said the same thing she said every week, in the same voice she had used on terrified 3rd graders for 30 years. The voice that was patient and firm and warm all at once. What is taken from us does not come back, but what we give, what we choose to give, stays forever. And Juno. I need to tell you about Juno. He was 16 months old now, nearly 300 kilograms, taller than Jake at the shoulder, faster than any staff member when he decided to run, which he did often, with a loping, joyful gait that made the ground tremble and the visitors laugh, and the other elephants scatter out of his way. His ears had grown into his head. His trunk had developed the dexterity and the strength of an adult's, capable of pulling branches from trees and picking up objects as small as a peanut. His eyes were dark, intelligent, watchful. The eyes of an animal that had seen more in 16 months than most creatures see in a lifetime. And on his face, where 2 perfect ivory buds had once been growing, there were 2 smooth patches of skin, slightly darker than the gray surrounding them, slightly raised, like the ghost of something that used to be there. He would never have tusks. Among the other elephants, he would always look different. In the wild, the absence would have marked him, made him vulnerable, set him apart in ways that mattered. But Juno did not live in the wild. He lived in a place where a Cuban veterinarian had dedicated her life to keeping him alive, where a former Navy SEAL sat outside his fence at 3 in the morning, because the sound of his breathing was the only medicine that worked, and where, every Saturday, a silver-haired woman in wire-rimmed glasses walked through the gate carrying an apple, and he ran to her, and his trunk found her shoulder, the same spot, every single time, and she stood there with her hand on his enormous head, and said the words that had started everything, the words from the creek, the words that had pulled him from the water, and pulled her from the grief, and pulled Jake from the guilt, and pulled a whole town from its indifference. I got you, baby. I still got you. The last scene in this story takes place at bus stop number 14. It is a Saturday afternoon, March. The light is pale and gold, the kind of light that Tennessee makes in early spring, when the sun is low and the air is clean, and every color looks like it has been freshly painted. Maggie is sitting on the bench, the same bench, Dale Hutchins' bench, but she is not waiting for a bus. She is waiting for Jake. He picks her up every Saturday now, drives her to Hollow Creek, drives her home. It is their routine. It is their rhythm. The kind of small, repeated kindness that does not make the news but holds the world together. A truck pulls up. Jake is behind the wheel, window down, one arm on the door. He does not honk. He does not wave. He just stops, and Maggie stands, and she walks to the passenger side. And on the back seat, there is a cardboard box of apples. Because Juno loves apples. Because Maggie has learned exactly which variety he prefers. Honeycrisp. Always Honeycrisp. He will spit out a Red Delicious like it has personally offended him. And because the small act of bringing food to someone you love is as old as love itself. They drive. They do not talk much. The silence between them is the kind that only exists between people who have been through something together that was larger than words, who do not need to fill the air because the air is already full. The road winds through the hills, past the dogwoods, past the creek where everything began, past the bend where Maggie first heard the sound that changed her life. When they arrive at Hollow Creek, Juno is already at the fence. His trunk is up, the tip curling and uncurling, testing the air. He knows she is coming before he sees her. Elephants remember scent. Elephants remember everything. Maggie steps out of the truck. She takes an apple from the box. She walks toward the fence. And Juno moves toward her from the other side. Not running, not panicking, just walking, steady and certain. The way you walk towards someone you have been waiting for. Someone you trust completely. Someone who held your head above the water when you were drowning, and has never once let go. His trunk reaches through the fence and finds her shoulder. The same shoulder, the same spot, the same gentle pressure. And Maggie stands there, one hand on his head, the other holding a Honeycrisp apple that he will take from her in a moment, with the delicate precision of a creature that could crush a watermelon, but chooses, with her, to be soft. And the life she thought had ended when Richard died, the life she had been waiting for at bus stop number 14, without knowing what she was waiting for, that life is here. It is right here. At the exact distance between a hand and a trunk, in the smell of wet grass and warm elephant skin, in the sound a young elephant makes when he sees the person he will never forget. A low, rumbling hum that is not quite a purr and not quite a word, but that means, in whatever language elephants speak to the humans who saved them, "You are here, you are here, you came back, and I knew you would." Tusks do not grow back, but love does. Every time, every place. With anyone brave enough to kneel in the mud and say, "I got you." You know what stays with me about this story? It is not the drama. It is not the Navy SEAL or the poachers or the midnight fight. It is the simplest part. A 65-year-old woman heard something crying, and she did not walk away. That is it. She did not have a plan. She did not have training. She did not wait for someone more qualified to show up. She just stepped into the water because something needed her, and she decided that was enough of a reason. I think about that every day. Because life puts those moments in front of all of us. Not with elephants, maybe, but with people. A neighbor who looks tired. A stranger who seems lost. A friend who has stopped calling. A child who is sitting alone at lunch. We hear the cry. We all hear it. The only question is whether we step in or keep walking. Maggie stepped in, and because she did, 3 lives changed. Hers, Jake's, Juno's. A whole town woke up. That is what love does when one person decides to act. It does not stay small. It spreads. It becomes something bigger than the person who started it. You do not need to save an elephant. You just need to save the moment. The one right in front of you. The one that is asking for your attention right now. If this story moves something inside you, share it with someone who needs it today. Leave a comment and tell me what moment in your life made you step in when you could have walked away. Subscribe so you do not miss the next story, because there are more, and they are waiting for you. And to everyone watching right now, wherever you are, whatever you are carrying, I pray that God blesses you and your family. I pray He gives you the courage to step into the water when the moment comes. I pray He puts someone in your life who will say the words we all need to hear. I got you. If you believe that, type Amen in the comments. Let me see it. God bless you all.